Hi, thanks for tuning in to this sermon video. My name is Will Lowen, and I'm the pastor here at Trinity Mennonite Church. And what we've decided to do for this Sunday and probably for the next little while, since we can't meet in a physical space together, we've decided we're going to live stream one video, which will be a time of reading and praying and discussing together. And that'll happen in a private, members-only Facebook group. Now, if you're part of our fellowship and you aren't a part of that page and you would like to be, just let me know. We can make that work. But I thought it would also be good to separate the teaching time out of that to make it more widely available. And so that's what we're doing this morning. And if you've stumbled upon this page, this video from elsewhere, or you've got somebody to refer this to you, Trinity Mennonite Church is a Mennonite Church Canada congregation. We are just south of Calgary, Alberta. We seek to be a church that is walking in the ways of Jesus, and everyone is welcome. And if you'd like to be a part of what we're doing here and who we are, just let me know, and we would be happy to have you become part of our fellowship. I'm going to start with the scripture reading from this morning, and it comes from the Gospel of John. It's a longer passage, so buckle in. I'm also reading from the Common English Bible, so it may be a little bit different than what you are accustomed to. But this is John chapter 11, starting at verse 1, and I will be reading to the end of verse 48. So here we go. A certain man, Lazarus, was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This was the Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, saying, "Lord, the one whom you love is ill." And when he heard this, Jesus said, "This illness isn't fatal, it's for the glory of God, so that God's Son can be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. When he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was. After 2 days, he said to his disciples, "Let's return to Judea again." The disciples replied, "Rabbi, the Jewish opposition wants to stone you, but you want to go back?" Jesus answered, "Aren't there 12 hours in the day? Whoever walks in the day doesn't stumble because they see the light of the world. But whoever walks in the night does stumble because the light isn't in them." He continued, "Our friend Lazarus is sleeping, but I am going in order to wake him up." The disciples said, "Lord, if he's sleeping, he will get well." They thought Jesus meant that Lazarus was in a deep sleep, but Jesus had spoken about Lazarus' death. Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died. For your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there so that you can believe. Let's go to him." Then Thomas, the one called Didymus, said to the other disciples, "Let us go too, so that we may die with Jesus." When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was a little less than 2 miles from Jerusalem. Many Jews had come to comfort Mary and Martha after their brother's death. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, while Mary remained in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask God will give you." Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha replied, "I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though they die. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She replied, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, God's Son, the one who is coming into the world." After she said this, she went and spoke privately to her sister Mary. "The teacher is here and he's calling you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to Jesus. He hadn't entered the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were comforting Mary in the house saw her get up and quickly leave, they followed her. They assumed she was going to mourn at the tomb. When Mary arrived where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." When Jesus saw her crying and the Jews who had come with her crying also, he was deeply disturbed and troubled. Jesus asked, "Where have you laid him?" They replied, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to cry. The Jews said, "See how much he loved him." But some of them said, "He healed the eyes of the man born blind. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying?" Jesus was deeply disturbed again when he came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone covered the entrance. Jesus said, "Remove the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said, "Lord, the smell will be awful. He's been dead 4 days." Jesus replied, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you will see God's glory?" So they removed the stone. Jesus looked up and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. I know you always hear me. I say this for the benefit of the crowd standing here, so that they will believe that you sent me." Having said this, Jesus shouted with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his feet bound and his hands tied and his face covered with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Untie him and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who came with Mary and saw what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. The chief priests and Pharisees called together the council and said, "What are we going to do? This man is doing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. Then the Romans will come and will take away both our temple and our people." This is a long story, and there's a lot going on in it. I just wanted to sort of set the context. I feel like if I was preaching this same sermon a few weeks ago, it would have gone entirely differently. We would have connected it to Easter, the event of Easter, and how this was a sort of a foreshadowing of resurrection. We might have used this to challenge each other, maybe even other people, to faithfulness. But given the situation that we're in, given that sickness and death is much more on our minds than it was before, the story has come alive in a way. It has a deeper meaning than it would have a month ago, even a few weeks ago in some of our circles. So what I would like to do as a focus for this reflection is to look at the role of religion as it is demonstrated in this story in positive and negative ways. Religion is a tricky word to define, and so generally for me, I use religion to mean a collection of beliefs and practices by people in response to an unseen order. There are a lot of people, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others, who use religion as a pejorative, as a sort of a negative term. There are a lot of people who use it interchangeably with culture and other things like that. So what's happening in this story, we come into this story as readers, and we're left with a lot of questions. And I think sometimes when there's an obvious question that we would like to answer, and we can't, it's probably intentionally ambiguous. So the first obvious question that jumps out is why? Why did Lazarus die? What's the disease or ailment that he has? And it doesn't tell us. It would be helpful if there was a virus going around and Lazarus caught it. That would certainly be applicable in our situation. Was there some sort of general illness that he had? Had he been struggling with something for a few years and Jesus knew this was coming? Well, that would have been a different story too. But it's left ambiguous. The writer doesn't explain to us and probably is telling us it doesn't really matter how or what exactly the nature of Lazarus' death was. Lazarus has died, and the specifics, the mechanics of it are not helpful and not relevant for us to dwell on those. Also, Jesus and his disciples are nearby, but they don't respond. Well, what are they doing? Is there something more important somewhere else? Or is this just Jesus is delaying on purpose to teach them a lesson? Well, it doesn't tell us what else Jesus was doing. And I think this is also intentionally ambiguous. A lot of times, we as human beings, we like to be in control. We like to have the answers that are available to us. And so when we know the why, we think that we will be more comforted. And so for people who want to identify with Mary and Martha in this story, they would love to know the why their loved one passed away. But it's not here. Why? What else was Jesus doing that was more important? Well, we don't know that either. Why did Jesus choose not to heal in this instance when he had chosen to heal in other instances? We don't know. And these are questions that we may never quite get answered. So to paint the context here, it seems that what Mary and Martha and the community around them are doing is celebrating what Jews still today call sitting Shiva. That's when the family and the loved ones gather around for a period of 30 days, but especially the first 7 days of sitting Shiva, where they mourn, where they grieve together, where they tell stories, where they sing songs. The community gathers together in a beautiful time of grief and sharing concerns and struggles and laughter and tears all together. It's a beautiful thing and a variation of what a lot of us do in our communities when somebody dies. So the people are there, the family members are there, various people in the community have gathered. Now, the Gospel of John specifically says that the Jews were there. Now, everybody living there would have been Jewish by religion. There would have been, some Samaritans living close by that might be sort of traveling through, or a few of them living in one of these villages. There would have been officials of the Roman occupying forces. They would have been around there somewhere. But then everybody else would have been Jewish. So when the Gospel of John says that the Jews were there, they mostly mean the leaders of the Jewish religion and the sort of employees of the Jewish religion, which is sort of a new contemporary word for an Old Testament concept. But the Jews were there as participants in Jewish religious systems. They were there to sit Shiva with this family, and they were carrying out the religious tasks. That's what they were doing there. And so my focus here in this reading is the role of religion in pandemic response. Sort of a subtitle to the bigger theme title of God, Show Us Your Power. Jesus does show power, but within the context of religion. So the first role of religion that we see is the opposition in general to Jesus, right? So Jesus hasn't even arrived at the scene. Jesus hasn't interacted with any of the people. They're in one of the other villages relatively nearby, and the message gets to Jesus, and he's thinking about going back, but the disciples say, hey, the Jewish leaders, the leaders of the Jewish religion, they don't want you there. In fact, if they see you, they've threatened to stone you. Right? So this is the gospel writer, John, is telling us that there is opposition. The Jewish religious system is opposed to Jesus and his teachings and his works. And this is sometimes the role of religion, is to set up gates, to set up fences, to protect the people from outside teachings. And this is, like all of these things, this is good and bad. There are sometimes outside teachings that leaders are in a position to know, that they've studied and they've heard and evaluated these teachings, and they've seen the fruit of them and said, this is destructive. This will lead us down a bad path. It will distract us. And there are lots of examples in the Old Testament of when it was a good thing that the religious leaders put up barriers and safeguards for outside teachings. So here, the Jewish religious system has said what Jesus represents is a threat, and we want to keep him out. But also, there's sort of a religious response that we will see a little bit more later on. But the disciples, they say, well, we need to stay here then, right? We need to protect ourselves so that we can continue to function as this group that we've created. And Jesus pushes back not only against that opposition, but he also pushes back against the self-protection and says, I'm going to take the risk because what I'm doing is more important than those who oppose me, and what I'm doing is more important than our understanding of self-preservation. So the second role of religion that we see in this story is sometimes a set of trite responses, right? So Jesus comes and he's chatting with Martha, and Martha already is responding to herself. She says, Lord, if you would have been here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. And then she corrects herself. She inserts the religious voice, and she says, but even now I know that whatever you ask, God will give you. And so sometimes it's helpful to have responses. We do this for ourselves. When we start to doubt our self-worth, we have religious sayings that we use to go beyond that. When we hear the self-criticism, then we can say, wait a second, I know whose I am. I know that I'm a child of God. So these voices that I'm hearing that undermine that, they don't matter. I am God's creation. I bear God's image in this world. God has a purpose. God has meaning. So those will sound trite to some people, but they are meaningful and life-giving for us. So sometimes the triteness interferes with real and necessary emotions like grief. And so this is what Martha is doing, grieving, but not really allowing herself to grieve, thinking that she needs to set those trite responses above that. But then Jesus responds with something a little bit deeper. And instead of just saying, we have these things to stop us from grieving, Jesus roots his response in his identity. Yeah, there will be a resurrection in the end, Jesus says, but there's another resurrection. I am the resurrection, Jesus says. That the hope that we are putting in this future day, put it in me, put it in the Son of God who's come to restore humanity. Put your hope in the resurrection, in God's gift. And when we do that, then it isn't trite. Then it isn't just a little idea that's there to suppress grief. Then it's a relationship. Then it's love, and it's a connection with God that way. The third role of religion that we see in this story is the role of ritual comfort. And so I explained what sitting Shiva was, and the Jews have come together to comfort Mary and Martha. And we see that here they are, and we know that they don't believe in Jesus. They don't recognize Jesus' healing power. But they're there. Jesus is there on the fourth day. The Jews are there on day 1 and day 2 and day 3 and day 4, and they will be there in some fashion until day 30 of the whole grieving process. They would be if the 30 days were necessary. So they are there as a way of bringing a religious response, the response of ritual comfort. But Jesus' response goes a little bit beyond that. It doesn't replace it, it doesn't minimize it, it goes beyond. So the Jews show up, And I think the storyteller is presenting this intentionally, saying that these are the Jews. These people are here out of religious obligation and duty, and they are not here as friends. Right? I think there's sort of a separation there. That when people come to mourn with you out of religious duty, it can be helpful and it can be beautiful. But when your friends and loved ones come to grieve with you, it's something so much deeper. It's something so much more powerful. So when Jesus comes, he isn't there to provide ritual comfort. He is there to suffer with them. So when it says in verse 35, here in the Common English, it says, Jesus began to cry. So he's not just leading them through rituals of comfort. He is suffering with them. And if you've been in a place of deep suffering and somebody has come to walk alongside you, that is as powerful or more than somebody who isn't suffering to come alongside and tell you that everything will be all right. Jesus grieves with us. Jesus suffers with us in our losses, in our pain, in our illness. Jesus suffers with us, which goes beyond ritual comfort. Jesus suffers with us, and in that we have comfort. In his co-suffering love, then we experience a release from the burdens that grief and mourning and pain bring to us. The fourth role of religion that I wanted to point out from this story is sort of a pragmatic realism. Religion doesn't happen in isolation. And that's part of the uniqueness of our situation, that we are isolating ourselves, and yet we are still very social creatures with social habits like gathering for worship. And so when people gather together, there are people who are sometimes officially appointed or who appointed themselves, who step in with words of pragmatic comfort, pragmatic realism. So here's Jesus. He's arrived on the scene. He's suffering with them, mourning with them, and he says, let's roll away the stone. And the people who have gathered to provide comfort and reassurance, but also realism, they've said, it's going to smell. We can't do that. And most of us would do something similar. And so there's this pragmatic realism that we, the people, bring. I'm not suffering, and so I get to help you, which we need sometimes. When I'm down and I'm feeling like I'm not worth anything, then I need somebody there who isn't feeling down, who isn't feeling like they're not worth anything, to tell me, hey, this will pass. You are a person of worth and value. You are a person who is loved. They're not suffering, they're bringing pragmatic realism, and that is critically necessary. But here, Jesus interferes with pragmatic realism. Jesus responds with reckless love. He's not afraid to look stupid. He's going to cry in front of other people. As a leader, as a teacher, he's going to emotionally expose himself in front of other people who maybe haven't met him before. So he's also going to go beyond that in showing reckless love. Now, the history of the church responding to pandemics is a long one. In early days, when the pandemics would come and people would start to die, the healthy people who perceived themselves to be healthy would pack up their things and leave, wondering what evil had happened to that village. Well, there were Christians in the area who said, wait, there are people suffering there. And so while some people were running in fear, the Christians would run in love to the city to bring relief and comfort to those who were suffering. And yeah, some of them died. Some of them died by acquiring the disease that they were responding to. But when this happened and the people who had been left behind in the village realized, wait, all of the people we thought cared about us, they left, they're gone. But the church, the Christians, they cared, they showed love. I want to be a part of that. And so in the early days of the church, it saw growth in response to this. In medieval times, in the time of the bubonic plague, Christians gathered together to pray. when the plague arrived in a village, the Christians would come together and pray. Well, effectively, that spread the disease even more. And so now we would say, well, that was foolish of them. Well, in that praying, they also brought comfort to each other, necessary comfort. The role of the church in response to those pandemics wasn't a matter of opposing the caution that the government might have put in place. The role wasn't to step in and ignoring the reality of the disease. The role was to step in and show love regardless of the limitations, regardless of the disease. And so the church now won't gain its credibility by opposing government caution. The church now won't gain credibility by over-exaggerating the need for hand sanitizer. The church will gain and demonstrate credibility by responding in love when other people want to walk away. Finally, the last role of religion is one that I mentioned a little bit before, is the need to defend one's right to exist. Now, this seems like a standard human reaction. Well, it is. Religions are gatherings of people. And so when a group of people gather together, they feel that they are allowed to continue to gather. And so this is what's happened here, that the Jewish system has been set up. They're protecting themselves against outside threats, namely Roman occupying forces, Greek cultural values. And so they're wanting to protect themselves, to secure themselves against outside threats. And so they recognize in the last few verses that I read, that when Jesus is doing more and more miracles, he's going to get more and more attention from the Romans, who will then be forced to step in with violence. And this is what they're wanting to resist. If we don't cause trouble, then we will be able to continue to gather. So we need to take the troublemakers out. So when we ask the question, why did Jesus die, like we would ask about why Lazarus died, well, this is what it was, because Jesus was willing to cause trouble. Jesus didn't die because he healed people. Jesus didn't die because he miraculously fed people and said nice things to people. Jesus died because he represented a disruption of the way things were being done. And disruptions threaten the stability of what people know. And when that happens, the people want to quell the disruption. We can be a disruption not by recklessly increasing the risk of spreading the disease. We can be a disruption by going out of our way to show love. By not thinking about just ourselves and our family, but about everybody, responding in love in ways that we are doing. So I've been hearing wonderful stories of people checking in on neighbors and bringing supplies to loved ones, and I'm hoping that'll still happen. Because religion can be a force for evil when we use it to defend our own interests and forget about other people. But religion is supposed to be a good thing, to connect us with the unseen order of the needs of other people equal to, even above, our own. Jesus stepped in with co-suffering love, with reckless love, directing the hope to a relationship with God rather than self-preservation. So in these difficult and unstable days, I'm hoping that we will find comfort in the words of Jesus. I'm hoping that we will find comfort in our relationship with Jesus, the one who suffers with us and the one who, through reckless love, will bring us to a restoration of relationship with God. Thanks for tuning in.